Okay, so today we're going to be talking about parallelograms. And so we're going to talk about their properties and how to tell if you actually have a parallelogram or not. So the first thing is a parallelogram is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel to each other. So it makes sense with its name. Parallelogram has all four sides where two pairs of opposite sides will be parallel to each other. Okay. Definition of a parallelogram. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So, um, a parallelogram traditionally looks like this. You know, those two match each other, they're parallel. These two guys are parallel to each other as well. Okay. Now, on the other hand, technically, a rectangle is a parallelogram as well. Why? Because it fits the definition of what a parallelogram is. On a rectangle, these two sides are parallel to each other, and so are these two sides parallel to each other. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, and so would a square be. Okay, so you're like, hey, does it fit the qualifications for being a parallelogram? Yeah, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel to each other. So it would be a rhombus. Okay, so all these would be considered parallelograms because they fit the bill. Okay, so just because it's a parallelogram doesn't mean it doesn't have a more specific name that we could call it. But a parallelogram has a pretty low bar. Both pairs of sides have to be parallel to each other. And the symbol we could use is using the word parallelogram or just putting a parallelogram in front of the four letters. Now you have to follow it around the shape, one way or the other. So A, B, C, D, or you could start at like C and then be like, let's go around it. So you'd start at C. So go C, A, B. Okay. C, D, A, B. Sorry. You don't have to go around clockwise or counterclockwise. You just start at a point and go around the shape. And you just have to say what shape it is. So put that word or put that symbol in front of the four letters you're going to do. Okay. But if you have a parallelogram, it has features, okay? A parallelogram is a four-sided figure where both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, okay? Now, if that's the case, what's going to happen is both opposite sides, so these two sides will be congruent to each other, and then these two sides will be congruent to each other as well. Both pairs of opposite sides will be congruent. Next thing is consecutive angles. Consecutive means in a row, will be supplementary. So if you add this one to this one right here, you're going to get 180 degrees. Okay, and then also if you add this one to this one right here, you're also going to get 180 degrees. And then so on. If you add these two together, you're going to get 180 degrees. So consecutive angles add to be 180 degrees. And that's kind of weird, but it's because remember when we had parallel lines and you had a transversal? These two interior angles is going to be kind of what this one and this one right here would be. Those two, if these top and bottom sides are parallel. Okay, so like let me pick a nicer color. If the top and the bottom are parallel, and this is the transversal, these two angles make 180 degrees, okay, because they're same side interior, okay, and all the way around the shape. So consecutive angles will be supplementary because they're same side interior. So that's something good to know. Okay, because these two sides are parallel, these two angles will be supplementary. And then also because I can go on the side, because these two sides are parallel, these two angles will be supplementary. So going around the shape, that's going to be true. Okay, opposite angles will be congruent. So angle A and C will be congruent to each other. So angle A is congruent to angle C, and then also D and B will be congruent. Okay. And then if a parallelogram has one right angle, then they'll all be right. Okay, so if that's a right angle right there, you're like, hey, it's a parallelogram and one of those angles is 90. Well, then guess what? Because opposite angles are congruent, these two have to be 90. And because consecutive angles have to make 180, well, if these two plus to make 180 and that one's 90, well, then this one also has to be 90. And then opposite angles are congruent. So if you know you have a parallelogram and one of the angles is 90, they all will. Okay. And then the diagonals will bisect each other. Bisect means they cut each other in half. So when they meet in the middle, these two pieces of this shorter diagonal will be congruent to each other. And then there's going to be a longer diagonal on a parallelogram. Of that longer diagonal, the two halves will be congruent to each other. Okay, so you'll have a shorter diagonal and the two halves will be congruent to each other. And then there's a longer diagonal where those two sides will be congruent to each other. Okay, then the next thing we're going to talk about would be the diagonal of a parallelogram is going to be divided into two congruent triangles. Okay, and so I need to go find my charger. So I'm going to move and get my charger and talk at the same time. So if I sound like I'm moving, I am. Okay. The diagonal of a parallelogram divides the parallelogram into two congruent triangles. Well, what do you mean? Well, if you draw a diagonal either way, okay, so I'm going to draw one just on one part of this, okay? So if I draw a diagonal, say from A to C, and I could do it either way, but I'll just focus on one of them. That diagonal splits the parallelogram into two congruent triangles, meaning and I'll show you why. It has to do with, remember, opposite sides are congruent. And then remember, by proving triangles, this middle side is a common side between both triangles. So by side, 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 we know the two triangles formed when you split a parallelogram in half will be congruent by side, side, side. Okay, so, and you can do it either diagonal, splits the triangle into two congruent triangles. So parallelograms have all these properties, meaning opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary to each other because of same side interior. Opposite angles will be congruent. If one of the angles is right, they all are. The diagonals will chop each other in half. And then also the diagonal will form two congruent triangles out of the original figure. Now, normally, we can prove it, with lots of ways to show, hey, this must be a parallelogram. But the main way that we show this is going to be by showing that opposite sides are parallel to each other. So later in the chapter, I'll give you guys some ordered pairs. I'm like, hey, is this a parallelogram? And so the question is, can you show it? And normally we'll show that something is a parallelogram by showing that opposite sides are parallel to each other. So let's just quickly look at this. I'm not going to ask you to do this for a couple sections, but if you want to show that this is a parallelogram, we go to -4, -2, and that's F, and then -2, 2, that's G, 4, 3, that's H, and then 2, -1, that's J. Okay, so if you connect these, and I don't have a ruler on me, but I'm just going to say if you connect these, okay, and so if you find the slope, again, that's how you tell that they're parallel, right? And so if we want to find the slope from G to F, you can either use the slope formula to say, hey, from here to here, can you find the slope? Or could you count it on this figure? The slope here is going to be 2/1. So I'll just say the slope is 2. And then if you do the slope over here on this side, the slope is going to be 2/1, so m is equal to 2. So these two sides have a slope of 2. Okay, if you did the slope formula, you'd get the same answer. Okay, and then on the top and the bottom, if we find the slope here and the slope here, we could do rise over run. And you could do the slope formula as well. The slope here is going to be 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is 1/6. And the slope here is also going to be 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I didn't draw the best. 1/6. And again, you could calculate the slope by doing y2 minus over x2 minus x1. And so I could say, oh, from F to G, my slope is 2 minus the -2 over -2 plus 4. That's 4 over 2. That's equal to 2. You could do from H to J, -1 minus 3, 2 minus 4, -4 over -2. That is just 2 as well. So notice you can calculate the slope using the slope formulas, and then you could do G to H, 3 minus 2, 4 plus 2, that's 1 over 6. And then on the bottom would be F to J. You would do -1 plus 2 over 2 plus 4. That'd be 1/6. Okay, so if you show that opposite sides are parallel, you know you have a parallelogram. Okay, so we'll do that later in the chapter. I just wanted you guys to see that. Now, on the rest of these questions, they're going to say, hey, you have a parallelogram. Can you use the fact that we have a parallelogram and parallelogram's properties to find the missing data? Okay, so in the first one it says, ooh, I know this is a parallelogram. Given it's we know it's a parallelogram. Can you find, if you know this angle, can you find this one here? And you have to think, okay, what do I know about parallelograms? Parallelograms have a lot of things that are true. Go back to the front. And the thing we're going to use is that consecutive angles are supplementary. What's that mean? That means since these two lines are parallel, these two angles will be supplementary. So this right here would be 180 minus 110. That will give us 70 degrees for the angle in question. Okay, so that's kind of cool. The next one says, hey, I have a parallelogram. What will this angle be? Well, in parallelograms, opposite angles are congruent. So what's the measure of that angle? QRS is going to be 145 degrees. Okay, so next thing, find the missing values for X and Y. Well, we know lots of things are true about these angles, including that these two angles are going to be supplementary. Why? Because they're same side interior between parallel lines. So if you do 6x plus 12x, you're going to get 180. So that means 18x is equal to 180. It means x is equal to 10. Okay, so that's what x is. Then, if we know what x is, we can figure out that 12 times 10 gives us this angle to be 120. And these two angles, opposite angles in a parallelogram, are always congruent. So we know that 3y is equal to 120. Divided by 3, you get y is equal to 40. Okay, so kind of have to know what properties are true if we know we have a parallelogram. In the next one, in a parallelogram, can we find x and y? Well, opposite sides are going to be congruent. That doesn't look like it is a parallelogram. We could probably better call it a rectangle, but they're saying, hey, it is a parallelogram. So we know opposite sides are equal in size, they're congruent. So you know 30x is equal to 150. Divide by 30. You get x is equal to 5. If x equals 5, then 72 times 5 will give us the length of this shape, which is 360. It's kind of weird to have a side be 360. Normally you talk about angles being 360, but this length is 360 units. So therefore, this side and this side are equal because opposite sides are congruent. So 2y is equal to 360. So y is equal to 180. Okay, so kind of talking about opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent. Do you know the properties of parallelograms? Okay, so the next one says, hey, we've got a parallelogram. How do you know? It says it. Find the value of x. Well, in a parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent. So we can say 3x plus 25 equals 5x minus 5. We can move the x's to the same side. Get 25 equals 2x minus 5. Add 5 to both sides. We get 30 equals 2x divided by 2. X equals 15. So we know x is 15. If x is 15, then we can find the measure of either of these angles. They should be the same. So if you do 5 times 15, and you subtract 5, so that would be 30, 60, 75 minus 5. So that this degree would be 70 degrees. Let's do it up here and see if it works. So 3 times 15 is 45 plus 25. That is 70 degrees. So the truth is, yes, both those angles are congruent. To find the other two angles, remember consecutive angles, since they're same side interior, will be supplementary. So this would be 180 minus 70, which would be 110. So these are both 110. So if we fill in what angles are which, this would be 70, and so would angle C. And then these guys would be 110. And if you add up all 4 angles inside this quadrilateral, they should make 360. And if they don't, you botch something, but they do. In a parallelogram, what do we know about the diagonals? We know we have a longer one and a shorter one, but we know they bisect each other. Okay, so when they meet, they chop each other in half. So that means these two match, and then also these two are congruent to each other. Well, all we care about is this longer diagonal where the two halves are congruent to each other. So we can say 3z minus 4 has to equal z plus 5. Subtract z to both sides. You get 2z minus 4 equals 5. Add 4 to both sides. You get 2z equals 9. Divide by 2, you get z is equal to 4.5. Okay, so diagonals are chopped in half by each other. The bottom group says, given the picture, from what you can tell, the given factors from each picture, would this be a parallelogram, yes or no? Okay, and why? And so we've got the 5 things from the front. The 5 things from the front would be, how you can show you have a parallelogram would be the definition of a parallelogram, which means opposite sides are parallel. The next one would be opposite sides would be congruent, both pairs. The third one would be consecutive angles will be supplementary. Opposite angles will be congruent, and I would not use this one to show it. The diagonals bisect each other. And then if they chop each other into 2 congruent triangles. So these are the ones that I would use. I would probably, if you see 4 right angles, yes, it would be a parallelogram. Okay. But each of these factors are properties of a parallelogram. So if you have them, well, then you know that you have a parallelogram. So any of those things from the front. Okay, so the first one, if these 2 angles are congruent, okay, and the other 2 opposite angles are congruent, would we have a parallelogram? And the answer is yes. Why? Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. And that's what our factors from the front. The next one, would this be a parallelogram? Well, I know that these 2 match each other. Would the other 2 match? And the answer is they will. And how do I know? Well, how I know is that we have a quadrilateral, which has 360 degrees. And if you minus off these 3 values, okay, you are going to get this other angle to be 130 degrees. So the answer is yes. Why? Same reason. Both pairs, opposite angles, are congruent. Okay, so if you minus off the 3 angles you know from 360, you're going to get that 4th angle to be 130. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Is this a parallelogram? Well, the answer is yes. Why? Both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. That's one of the features of a parallelogram. The next one, do you see, remember the 2 triangles mean parallel? I see a set of parallel sides. Is that enough to show we have a parallelogram? No. Why? Not both pairs okay, so only one pair of parallel sides, okay? All right, will these be parallel? Parallelogram. Yes. Why? Diagonals bisect each other. Right. And the last one? Yes. Why? Both pairs of sides are parallel. So you could have used any of the features from the front side, but checking to say, okay, do you have enough to show that this is a parallelogram? And when we go to show it ourselves in a couple sections, we really are just going to show our opposite sides parallel. So do these two sides, are they parallel to each other by finding their slopes? Are these two sides parallel by finding their slopes? And so if they both are, then you're going to say, yes, we have a parallelogram. All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.